I'm Grant Broom, and I'm a web accessibility consultant and director at Dig Inclusion. And we presenting this this webinar in association with our partners in e-learning, which is Agile Actors. And today we're going to be talking about web accessibility. We're going to approach accessibility in quite general terms. It's not really going to be specific to any particular role that you have. So there should be something in this for everybody, but we won't get into any specifics. So it's going to be quite general. I want to start off by talking about accessibility and what is accessibility. And it's the dictionary definition that I got from a Google search actually is the fact of being able to be reached or obtained easily. And it's that word easily that is often missed when we're trying to deliver accessibility. And sometimes in testing, we can, because that's a large part of what we do and a part of my job, is that we kind of get bogged down in does this particular piece of content satisfy the standards or the test criteria that we're looking at, instead of really thinking, well, how easy it is for someone to be able to use this product. And that's a very important key factor in accessibility, because if you can make something easy for someone to access, someone with a disability or without a disability, then you've achieved inclusion. And inclusion is the action or state of including or being included within a group or structure. And inclusion feels really good. If you want to be involved in something, or you want to be a part of something, or you want to do something, and you feel included in maybe the thought process for doing that thing, then that feels good to you. It's the opposite of exclusion, where if we want to get involved in a group, or if we want to do something or achieve something, and we haven't been considered in that process, or we're not allowed to be part of that group, then that feels bad. And we react quite strongly to that as human beings. And the law protects us from that as well. So if we have a protected characteristic like having a disability, then that means that if we try to do something or operate something that's not inclusive, that's not accessible, then that means that we've got legal rights to challenge that under a legal framework. And we'll have a look at those legal frameworks a little bit later on as they relate to European law and UK law. So accessibility, it's all about people. It's all about understanding the different needs of users and making sure that those needs are met. So it's not a simple matter, because lots of people have lots of different needs and different preferences. So being able to understand those needs and preferences is a very important aspect of accessibility. Now, we've got lots of guidelines out there, we've got lots of legislation out there, but the core of really delivering accessibility is understanding the user and what it is that they're about. Because in terms of accessibility, and it's in particularly digital accessibility, where people have all the assistive technologies, and when I talk about assistive technology, I mean a device or a piece of software that helps someone with a disability access digital content. Those are already built into things like your mobile phones. They're built into your operating system. And there's also a load of third-party tools out there that people can install on their machines or on their mobile phones to help them access things. And because people have all these tools, because these tools allow people to have unfettered access to the web or to applications, what we typically find is that the barriers that they do find to access aren't presented by the software, they're not presented by their own disability, they're presented by things that we do wrong. So, we don't create things in an accessible or inclusive way. Maybe that's through lack of knowledge or lack of education. It's rarely through people just not caring. People do care about accessibility, people do care about inclusion. It's usually through maybe a lack of knowledge or lack of skills or lack of awareness that people make mistakes when it comes to accessibility. So disability in the medical model is often thought of, or is thought of, as a personal health condition, not being able to see, not being able to hear, or maybe not being able to move. But the way that we need to think about disability so that we provide good access to the things that we create is through the social model where the disability is a mismatched human interaction. The disability doesn't rest with the user, the disability rests with the component. That's what makes people disabled, the fact that it doesn't work for them. It's a mismatch. And that's what we trying to, and that's what we really want to address with accessibility, making sure that those mismatches don't exist, or there's as few of them as possible. What sort of numbers are we talking about here? Well, if you take any population across the world, you'll find that about 20% of that population will have a disability. So they'll be registered with a disability. You can find these statistics anywhere. They're well supported. There's quite a large number of people in a general population that have a disability. And you could be missing out on people accessing your product or your services just by not considering accessibility. And when we put that into the context of maybe the 2 or 3% of gains that we would hope to get from optimizing search engine optimization or SEO, then that brings into context the opportunities that we're missing, let alone the people that we make him feel excluded. As a pure business proposition, accessibility makes an awful lot of sense because you're able to reach a lot more people than you were before by making your product accessible. And if you're looking at the analytics of your product and seeing these dropout rates and you don't know why, so people get to a certain point in maybe your product and then you see people dropping out, a big reason for that could be that your product isn't accessible at that particular page or that particular component. It's just not working for that person, and they'll drop out. And to you, this will seem like a mystery because you don't have any metrics telling you about whether that person had a disability or not. All you know is maybe what browser they were using, what operating system, and how long they were on the site or page and things like that, but nothing about what assistive technology they were using. And it's probably not a good idea to scan for that either, just for privacy reasons. So, we are talking about significant numbers here that we can ensure have better access to our products and to gain to allow people to have better access to what we do. In addition, there is probably another 20% of the population that don't have a disability or don't have a permanent disability that are going to benefit from what you're doing by when you make something more accessible. And that 20% of the population could include people who, I had it this morning, I went outside, I was in bright sunlight and I was trying to use my phone and I couldn't see properly because my eyes are getting a bit iffy as well now too. So the ability to be able to increase contrast of the text, or zoom in on text to make it larger and easier to read is really, really important. Other things like making sure that you're future-proofing your application by making sure that it's got the right things in there to be not only rendered by screen readers and other assistive technologies, but also by smart speakers, being able to talk to your devices or looking at future technologies. And by making your applications more accessible to people, to assistive technologies and to people using those, you're also making your platforms and your content more accessible to technologies that like smart speakers that can go and analyze a page and find out certain information and feed that back to you as well. So another thing that someone might find and that I found myself as well in my own life is a couple of years ago before COVID, when I was traveling around quite a lot, I'd be using my Google Maps to tell me where to go because I'd be dragging luggage and carrying things, and I just listened to Google Maps tell me to turn left, turn right while I was walking in unfamiliar cities and things like that. So accessibility is mainly about making sure that we provide access for people with disabilities, but it also makes products better for everybody. Let's come back and talk a little bit about the disabilities and the types of disabilities that will affect web use. And the first one here is quite an obvious one, and we talk about it a lot when it comes to accessibility and accessibility training and the things that we need to do to make things better, is people who are blind. Now, this gentleman is Andrea Bocelli. He's a famous singer, and he went blind when he was quite young. I think he was about 9 or 10. And I don't know anything about the way that he would access a computer. Actually, I do know about the way he would access a computer. I don't know how he does it in his day to day. But one thing I do know is that he will be using something called a screen reader. Now, a screen reader is a piece of software that sits on your computer or on your phone or other device, and the screen reader will read the contents of the screen back to the user. Now, it doesn't just read the text, it also tells us what the text is for. So if the text is a link, it will tell you that. If you have an image on the screen and the developers have put in some alternative text for that, it will read that. It'll tell you what's a heading, what's in a list. And it'll allow a user not only just to get the text into the page, but a feeling for the structure of the page, what's on the page, how many headings there are, how many links there are, how the information is maybe placed in a hierarchy according to maybe the headings. It's a very, very powerful piece of software that is very, very compatible with good websites. But if we produce websites or web applications without accessibility, then it can just seem like everything's just words. There's just content there, but there's no structure to it. And it can be very difficult for someone who's blind to navigate that environment in a non-visual way. So there's things that we need to consider about that, and that is make sure that anything that's not text has a text alternative. So we're talking about images and video specifically, and also to make sure that we use all the structures that are part of the native code. So this is a little bit codey, but for example, in HTML, the language that most web pages are built on, I am sure you all know that, we've got heading structures, so H1, H2, H3, right down to H6, which will allow us to convey how important a heading is to someone using a screen reader. And if we don't use those heading structures, say we use just non-semantic code like a div or span, then it's just read as text and the user doesn't know that that's a heading or that it conveys any particular importance. So those are the key things for people who are blind. Make sure that there is a text alternative for everything that we do that isn't text. And can't be read directly by the screen reader, and also to provide a good structure that allows people to navigate the page effectively. The next group of users are people with low vision. So people with low vision will not have great eyesight. They may struggle to see things that don't have good contrast. The vision may be blurry, or there may be parts of the vision where they aren't able to see, but other parts where they can. So they may have tunnel vision, or they may have something which is the opposite, where they have no central vision, but they do have peripheral vision. There's all sorts of different eye conditions that can result in low vision and somebody's ability to read something or to view content and decode that visually. And one of the things that we can do is to allow magnification of content. Now, you can normally do this within a browser. You can use the control and the plus keys to increase text size, control and scroll, lots of different ways. You can use the browser controls themselves to increase the magnification or the size of everything on the page. And that's very, very useful to people who have low vision and need to do that. Another thing that you can do is ensure that you've got good contrast on your pages. And the combination of those two things will allow a person with low vision to have the best chance possible to read the content that you've put there. If either of those things are missing, then there could be a difficulty. This is the late Professor Stephen Hawking, and he's as well as being a very famous scientist. He was also a lecturer and I suppose a friend, and the way that he communicated later in his life, because he had motor neuron disease, and what motor neuron disease did or does to someone is that they'll have good mobility maybe at some point in their life, and then the disease will take hold over a period of time until somebody has lost lots of their movement, and it ends up being fatal eventually. But Stephen has this, you can see a device attached to his glasses, and that's a camera that's detecting movement in his cheek. And by moving his cheek, he sends a signal to the computer that does something. And the computer is scanning different things that Stephen can do, and showing visually Stephen the options that he has. And when he twitches his cheek, he essentially picks an option, and he's able to do all sorts of things, including delivering lectures, speaking to his friends, and writing books. But for people with mobility impairments, things can be can take a bit more time. So if you can imagine typing just one key at a time instead of touch typing, that's kind of like what it might be like for someone with a mobility impairment. And that means that we've got to consider the time that it takes people to do things. We've got to consider that if we've got something like a session timeout, where we're telling the user that the time is up, then we have to allow the user enough time to be able to reach that session timeout dialogue and close it, and then continue and carry on with what they were doing before. Another thing for people with mobility impairments is that they're very often unable to use a mouse at all. So people with severe mobility impairments rely on keyboard access to things. And in those terms, we're really talking about maybe the tab key to move between active components, the up and down arrow keys to move between maybe options within a menu, or to scroll the page up and down. And this is because a user, even if they've got only one point of access, which we call a switch, they can use a virtual keyboard to type or scan or to interact with the content. So as long as you can do things via a keyboard, then you pass most of your tests for accessibility for mobility impairment. But that is sometimes a much harder task than it sounds, especially if you think about things like mega menus, where you may have hundreds of different items in a drop-down menu at the top of the page. Designing one of those to work for someone who's just using keyboard control can be quite tricky. And these things need to be thought about at the beginning of the project, and there must be a determination at the beginning of projects to make sure that there's an understanding of as many disabilities as possible, and of the common barriers that are put up accidentally, of course, or unintentionally, that are going to affect someone's web use. Then there are cognitive impairments. So this is Orlando Bloom, an actor. You've probably seen him in some films. And he's dyslexic, and he struggled a lot with dyslexia at school. And I've got 3 dyslexic children, and they've all really struggled with certain things. And it's a disability. It's a disability counted as a disability here in the UK. But in some senses, it's just a different way that the brain is wired. We haven't always read. As a population, reading hasn't been something that we've widely done before the past couple of hundred years. It's quite a recent phenomenon, and it appears that some people's brains are wired to be able to do this quite easily, to recognize characters, and then other people, these same characters seem to move around on the page, or they tend to disappear and reappear, or appear the wrong way around. And it's quite a common phenomenon. Dyslexia is quite prevalent in society. But that's just one disability type when we're talking about cognitive disabilities. And there are things like Asperger's, ADHD, short-term or long-term memory loss, anxiety, I suppose, can be a disorder as well. And these can all affect the way that a person reads information and understands information. And there are steps that we can do to try and make things better for them, by maybe creating content that is simpler to read, that it's just got better readability. Sentences are shorter, breaking up paragraphs so that there's a heading above each paragraph. maybe using bullet points instead of long paragraphs of explanation. These can all help someone with dyslexia to interpret the content of the page in a way that suits them. And also the other thing that we need to do in accessibility is allow people to set their own color contrast and their own text size and things like that, just in case they've got a specific problem with the text that we use in, or maybe the background and foreground color combinations, because these can really affect people with different cognitive impairments as well. So those things are also essential for accessibility. Adaptability, we call it in accessibility, making that interface as customizable as possible. But I'm not talking about overlays here. So a quick note on overlay, I'm going to talk about them later on as well. Overlays are those third-party plugins that you can pay monthly for that sit on your site, and they can allow users to do certain things. There are better ways to do things, more accessible ways to achieve that than using an overlay. The last group of users that I want to talk about is people who are deaf and using sign language. And of course, people who are deaf may have difficulty hearing things, and this is mostly a problem when we consider things like video content. So if you've got video content with audio, and maybe that audio is explaining how to do something or giving us some additional information that is not visual, and then that's a huge problem for people who are deaf, because they're unable to hear that audio, they're unable to process it, and therefore they're missing out on a whole range of information. So providing subtitles on your video content is good, something that will interpret what's being spoken, but even better than that is our captions. Now, captions are like subtitles in that they include things that are spoken, but also they'll include important sounds. So if we've got something like heavy machinery, off camera, or a phone ringing, or a door knock or something like that, that's important to the narrative of the information that we're conveying, then that needs to be included in the text as well. And that would be where we would use captions instead of subtitles, which is just about what people are speaking. As I said, 15 to 20% of the population have a disability, but the older the population gets, the more this increases. So over retirement age, this rises to 30% and keeps increasing. So you could get to, people in the 70s or 80s. If you look at that demographic, you could find that there's a very large percentage of people that aren't able to access your content because of their disability. So it's important to consider also the demographic of your audience. If you're in something like, a music industry, then it's probably the percentage is going to be less. But if you're talking about finance, pensions, and things like that, the percentage is going to be higher. But in any case, it doesn't matter. You don't want to miss out on providing your content to any of those demographics because of, because it makes business sense to make sure that they're included, as well as there being a legal obligation on you to make sure that happens. So breaking that down a little bit more, there are, and these are, I'll have to say, these are UK statistics. I don't know what they are for each of the countries that you're from. But in the UK, there are 2 million people who are blind or partially sighted, 5.5 million people who are mobility impaired, 10 million people who are deaf. So that will, largely include that older demographic that we talked about a little bit earlier. 2.2 million people have memory concentration or learning difficulties, and 2 million people have dyslexia, and that's out of a population of about 70 million. Okay, so that's it about the different disability types and accessibility and inclusion and why it's important. We're going to have another section now about the legal landscape and why it's important to make sure that we don't break any laws, essentially. So the first one that I want to show you is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the convention is intended as a human rights instrument with an explicit social development dimension. It adopts a broad categorization of persons with disabilities and reaffirms that all persons with all types of disabilities must enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms. And they will include things like access to digital content and just being treated fairly. And then we've got the European Accessibility Act 2019, which says that businesses benefit from having a common set of rules within the EU, which should facilitate easier cross-border trade. Persons with disabilities and elderly people will benefit from having more accessible products and services in the market. And then there's the EU directive that came out of that. And in this directive, it was very specific in stating the type of or the set of standards that we should be aiming for to make sure that sites were accessible and applications and mobile applications were accessible. And this is they refer to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So I'll probably refer to them as WCAG going forwards. If you look at Web Accessibility Guidelines, they're the first ones that come up. They're an internationally recognized standard for accessibility. That's what that's what this directive is based on. And then in the UK, we've got the public sector bodies, websites and mobile applications accessibility regulations, often referred to as PSBAR. And that again, this is built off the EU directive that says that essentially your components, or your websites and your applications must be accessible to a certain standard. And we'll talk about what that standard is in a second. There were certain deadlines for this. So if you're working in the public sector and you're not aware of these guidelines or these directives or regulations, and you may be new to accessibility, then it would definitely be the time to read up on these and find out what's supposed to have happened, because most of these deadlines have passed now. So if you had a legacy website, it needed to be accessible by last September. If you had a website in production, that needed to be accessible back in 2019. The only deadline left now is for mobile applications. So if you're developing a mobile application, or if you've got an existing mobile application, it must be accessible by the 23rd of June 2021. And by accessible, it has to meet a certain standard of accessibility, which I'll explain in a second. And then we've got the Equalities Act in Act 2010 in the UK, which says that if you've got a service and you're providing it to the public, it must be accessible to everybody. So these are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that I've talked about. They're currently version 2.1. There is a new version of these guidelines coming out this year, 2.2, expected sometime this summer, which will be the same as these guidelines, but just with a few additions relating to color contrast and a few other things that will make things easier for people with disabilities to access digital content. Now, these guidelines have been around for a long time in different versions. The first version came out in 1999. So there's been a long history of people like myself trying to follow these guidelines, interpret them, and help customers meet them. Now, these guidelines have three different levels of conformance. The first one is single A, and these are things like, these are essential things like alternative text for images, and also include having alternatives for video, making sure that you've got good structure in your pages and things like that. The AA conformance, or the AA level of conformance, which includes all the single A and the AA criteria. These are important. They include things like color contrast and maybe having audio description for video and things like that. So these are to achieve the government standards that we've been talking about, the EU directives and those other things. The AA conformance level is what you're aiming for. The AAA conformance criteria are useful. They include things like minimum reading age, and you should get as much of those in as possible, but you've already got 50 criteria to try and meet with single A and AA conformance. So you've already got quite a task in your hands. And lots of people are familiar with things like, well, you must have alternative text for images, and that's very important. But as in addition to that, there are 49 other criteria that you need to understand to make sure that you're delivering on accessibility. And I think this is where I think most organizations trip up, is that they have a general understanding of accessibility, or they understand a few key points very well. But there's lots of criteria that they've probably never encountered before, or they're not aware of, or maybe they're thinking about older guidelines. And there's this constant upskilling that needs to be done with accessibility to make sure that you're hitting your targets. Okay, so we'll have a look with what can go wrong with accessibility. So there's a few things that I want to point out. I just want to point out some key issues. So I know that some of you will be thinking about your own projects, about your own roles, and how you can make things better. What I'm going to talk about here is what can go wrong in terms of a project. What are the things that can hamper accessibility, and what can we do to mitigate those sorts of things? So the first place where projects go wrong, new projects go wrong, is procurement. It is very easy to procure software that isn't accessible, or that won't give you an accessible output, or doesn't support certain accessibility features. And if your procurement doesn't include a requirement for your suppliers to provide conformance services, then you're doomed to end up with something that's not very accessible. So, for example, you could get a content management system that doesn't allow you to generate an alternative text. That would be a very odd case. You'd be looking at some very old software if that was the case. But something like that, something where a content management system that helps you content authors to build a website doesn't include something that's important. A more common example might be to identify text that was in a different language. So say that we had an English language page, and then we had some Greek words in there. You must be able to mark up those Greek words as being Greek, so that the screen reader can flip from the English rules and the English understanding of letters and words into the Greek understanding of those, so it can pronounce those words properly. That's a single A requirement. That's one of the really essential requirements for accessibility. Some content management systems don't have that. So an understanding of those needs, and also a onus on your supplier to make sure that their systems or their services, and we're not just talking about software here, we're not just talking about platforms, we're also talking about suppliers of people. People need to have the right skills. The people that are employed on your project need to know what accessibility is. They need to have a very good understanding of what conformance looks like. So that's your designers, your project managers, your developers especially. They all need to know a great deal about accessibility in order to deliver an accessible project. And that might have to come through training if they don't already have it. If you're in procurement, then this presents you with a bit of a problem, in that you don't know for sure whether somebody has those skills or not, or whether a product has those features or not. And you're very much dependent on that vendor or that supplier to tell you whether it's there or not. And this is a little bit like the supplier marking their own homework and telling you that it does things. And they may not be aware that their own product has deficiencies and things like that. So you need to really do your research, you really need to do your homework. And again, accessibility needs to be part of that procurement process. It's not enough to just make decisions on software or resources based on price. It's got to be based on whether those services can provide an inclusive experience. Critically important. Often goes wrong at this stage. And what can happen is that you end up with something that's just not suitable for purpose. And that can be a very, very painful process that you can't really back out of, especially if you haven't said that you've got to have accessibility as part of that parcel. And when I say that you ask for accessibility as part of that parcel in procurement, it must specifically say AA conformant, WCAG 2.1 or WCAG 2.2 AA conformant, and that needs to be in the wording so that if there's any deficiencies, then it's measurable against those standards, and you can go back to them and say, we need this fixed. Similar to that, we've got legacy platforms and websites. So very often the things that we are using were built quite a long time ago. There's been no significant updates. Some of the very big infrastructure companies that are around, a lot of them have legacy platforms and websites that don't support accessibility very well. What do we do about them? This is probably an even trickier situation than procurement, because at least with procurement, if you make a new procurement, you've got chances of mitigating this. But when you're stuck with a legacy platform and website, then the best thing that you can do is take some advice from accessibility professionals in maybe patching the site as best as you can. And it's not a good way to do things. But what it will do is it will allow you to make temporary fixes to things until you can find a better solution further down the road. But what it does highlight, if you do have one of these systems that's underperforming in terms of accessibility, is the need to start addressing this now. You can't you can't brush under the rug. You can't think, well, it'll sort itself out later. It's something that needs to be addressed, and a roadmap to getting out of that situation in the future. Because some systems will generate code like this, which is kind of meaningless, and reams of it, and that's really no good for accessibility. The other challenge is there's also a bit of a skills shortage in accessibility. So we've talked about supply, and we've talked about procurement, but a lot of the problem is because the people just don't have the skills. And if you look at your typical developer, they work really hard. They've got lots of pressures on them. They do something which is great. They send it out to the testers send it back because it doesn't do something it needs to do. They're always chasing the tails. And sometimes the thing that they don't upskill on are things like accessibility, because if accessibility is not being tested, then it kind of doesn't count to the developer unless they've got a really strong ethic or a real drive to make sure that all of their content is accessible. It's one of the first things that gets dropped, or one of the things that gets learned the last is how to create accessible content. So if you do have a skills shortage like this, the way that you need to address this is through training. You need to, and product testing actually. So if you're not sure about your skills shortage, maybe you're a project manager or a product owner, and you have no idea about whether your product is accessible or not, or whether it's going to be accessible if you're starting on this journey, then that's something that you really need to find out. And to do that, one of the things you can do is maybe involve a third-party specialist accessibility organization to come in and help you with the testing, help you with assessment, assess your team to make sure that the stuff that they are producing is accessible, and train them up if they're not, and a good organization, accessibility organization, will be able to do that for you, is to make those assessments and do the training, and then hopefully you'll be in a better place to create an accessible product. I thought that funny, is it? Okay, and then another one is lack of accessibility testing. That's the A11Y tag that's often used to represent accessibility, because it's quite a long word to write. And I got a little video here. I think I'll play this. Let me start that again. I ruined that, didn't I? This is just robots trying to open a door. Okay, so the reason why I played that is because robots are really good at certain things. They're very good at automated repetitive tasks. But when it comes to innovation or doing something that's, I suppose, clever, they're not particularly good at it. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because there's a lot about automation in accessibility at the moment. Automated testing, not opening doors, but detecting whether alternative text for images there, or maybe whether there's a heading structure there or forms labeled. They're very good at certain types of accessibility where they can run a simple algorithm, get a result. When it comes to testing for human interaction, or maybe maybe something a bit more complicated, something a little bit more human, they're not very good at that sort of thing, and they often fail. So there are certain there's lots of different types of testing that we're going to talk about. There's 3 different types of testing. The first one, automated, and we use automated testing all the time at the conclusion. And it's very useful for spotting things like, or highlighting to us that maybe the alternative text for the images shown here aren't correct. So in this picture, I've got a picture of a kitten with the alternative text of cute kitten. That gets a 100% score for accessibility. And then the bottom image is a picture of a kitten with the alternative text of great white shark, and that also gets 100% for accessibility. And this is in the Google Lighthouse test. And the reason why both of these pass is because the test is only detecting the presence of alternative text. It's not really detecting whether that text is appropriate for the content or not. And in actual fact, either of these alternative texts could be right depending on the context, or they might be wrong depending on the context as well. Yeah, accessibility is a little bit more nuanced and a lot more complicated than being able to detect whether an alternative text is right for an image. So that's just one example. All of the AA criteria that we talked about in single A and AA, all of them have a problem or present a problem for automated testing, and all of them will need an element of manual testing. There's a figure bandied around that says about 30% of testing can be automated. I'd say that's probably about right, but the reliability of those results is lower than if someone was to test them manually. Now, a manual test, by comparison, I'll go into these now. So we've got automated tests, which you should always do on a website. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it. You should always run automated tests on the website because they're very quick, they're efficient, they're quite accurate for the things that they do well, not so much for the things they don't do well, but they are limited. The best way to provide to test is by using an expert review. So this is where somebody who's an expert in accessibility testing will look at the content and determine. Hello, go ahead. Is there a question? Oh, that's all right. Don't worry. And then expert review is where someone who's an expert at testing will test for the website using their own skills and using the knowledge of accessibility, using the knowledge of disability, and providing a review in that way. That's the most cost-effective and efficient way of testing, and that will give you more comprehensive results. The drawback is that they'll be done on fewer pages. So say you've got a page with a website with 600 pages on it, the expert review will probably only cover about 25 to 30 of those pages. But what it will do is extrapolate those results out. So it'll give you examples of where accessibility's gone wrong in those pages, go into great detail about those, offer the solutions, and then it's down to the project management team to make sure that those issues are extrapolated out to the rest of the website. And then we've got user testing as well, and user testing's quite important. Well, actually, it's very important to do, but only if budget allows. User testing can be very, very expensive. It can be limited to much fewer pages than even the 20 or 30 that you can do in an expert review. It's sometimes just limited to 1 or 2 journeys within that application. The results are great, but the other drawback, or they can be great, but the other drawback is that this is the opinion of the user, and it's all dependent on how they use the website on the day. They might be having a bad day. They might not be typical of users within their user group. So it's down to, again, an expert being able to determine whether the issues that they were finding was due to the website, whether improvements should be made there, what improvements they should be, or whether the issues they were found by the user was because they maybe didn't understand the process properly, or some other issue. So it can very often come down to user error sometimes, and it's hard to extract the user error from the data sometimes if you don't understand all those other aspects of accessibility, like how a screen reader works and those sorts of things. But it is definitely useful. Probably put it towards the end of a project when things are mainly built. The bulk of your focus should be on an expert review, and you should be running automated tests all the time, but always understanding that when they give you 100% result, that's 100% of the things that they could test. And I guarantee that there's going to be some errors in there as well. There's going to be false positives, there's going to be false negatives. So bear that in mind when running your automated testing. There's a note on overlays as well. So an overlay is a piece of software that sits on a website and tries to fix it. So for example, if you got a picture of a kitten on there, then it might try and give it the alternative text of kitten if that's missing, or it might say cat or something. What it's not going to know is the kitten's name. So if you're showing people a picture of a kitten George, it's not going to know that that kitten's George. Only you know that. So the automated overlay isn't going to be able to fix that. And similarly, if there's only about 30% of issues that can be fixed by automated testing, then that gives you an idea of what can be fixed by overlays, because they use the same type of robots to do that type of fixing. Some purport to use artificial intelligence, but I've seen them in use and they're not very good. So that's just a warning with overlays, is that they won't do, they're often oversold. They won't do what people will tell you that they will do. I'm using that example again. Okay. So this is thanks to John, a question from John about accessibility in the development cycle. I know I'm running a bit short on time, but I will tackle this. So this is a typical software development cycle where you've got planning, analysis, design, implementation. And then in step 5, you've got testing and integration, and then 6, maintenance. This is a very skewed model of development in my experience, away from testing and integration, because if you're not testing all through a project, then that's going to be problematic, because if you're not addressing things like accessibility in the planning stage, if it's not part of your analysis or your design, if you've not got accessibility in your design, and if you're not testing at that stage, you can run into all sorts of problems. Same with implementation. You should be testing while you're implementing. That's not a word, is it? While you're implementing, you should be doing some unit testing on things. So the model that I came up with, I've done a quick drawing, or there's another one that kind of does the same thing. The model that I came up with looked like this. Now it's a kind of a scratchy drawing, but you should be testing all the way through that cycle, or at least test planning. And I'm not just talking about accessibility testing, I'm talking about functional testing, unit testing, integrated testing. It should be done all the way through this. Before you release something, and you've got to be really sure that that product is meeting expectations before it's released. So that previous diagram didn't really address the stages, and I've kind of made my own stages here where I think accessibility needs to be put into the process. And the first one is at the requirement stage. To what standard does this product need to be accessible? And requirements, this is where you're thinking and planning and having ideas about the product. What does it need to do? does it need to be accessible? In most cases, the answer is just going to be yes. And then to what standard does it need to be accessible? You need to decide that as well. Always look to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, pick a version, pick a standard. I would say steer away from AAA conformance until you've built your first couple of AA conformance, because AAA conformance is difficult and it will have an impact on your design as well. I would say go for a AA conformance website. If you're in government, that's what you need to do anyway. Planning, now you need to ask what you need to do to make sure that the product meets the requirements. And that is, what people do you need, what software do you need, and things like this. Also planning, this is where you plan in your accessibility testing. So you'd say, we need some automated testing at this stage. This is where we're going to look at some third-party testing. And I would say you're always going to need to have third-party testing at some point, whether it's to help you understand whether you've got the right people at the start of the project in order to deliver further down the line, or whether it's mid-project to make sure that you're on course, or at the end, or all three of those things. You have to involve a third party at some point, unless you have got experts within your own organization. Very few people are in the privileged position of having an accessibility expert in there. So this is why you most likely need to go to a third party for it. Implementation, ask what skills or tools you need to ensure that you design and build to required standards. And then how am I going to know that I've got this right? This is validation. And again, this is third-party testing. Or if you've got some really good, if you've done some really good planning, you've got an excellent planning framework. And at Dig Inclusion, we've got a framework called Hugger, H-U-G-R, that you can go and look at, and that will guide you through the testing process. All of the criteria that you need to test against, and it'll have guidance in it. It's a long process, but you will be able to validate whether you've achieved that or not. So if you do have a very small budget, take a look at Hugger, H-U-G-R, and that will give you the framework. Otherwise, I again strongly recommend you go to a third party on this, unless you've got the expertise in-house. Maintenance, nailed it. How do I make sure that we don't introduce new issues? You have to think about this. You have to have a maintenance plan, so that when you're making new changes, when you're making improvements to the interface, which happens to all applications, that you're making sure that you build accessibility into that. And then review, how often could I get a formal third-party check? I would say every year at a minimum, because one of the things that happens with accessibility is regression, and we see it on much shorter time scales than a year. We see it happening within weeks. We have in 2-week sprints. We see that we go back and test a product after after its last sprint, and we found that there's defects that are there that weren't there before. It's very easy to introduce these things accidentally, unless your testing team are picking them up. And again, if you've got a testing team, they need to be skilled as much as possible in accessibility testing and have the tools that allow them to make good decisions when it comes to testing as well. I rushed that last bit. I'm sorry. I just realized that I was running out of time, but I'm going to give you a summary. And that is to plan for inclusion from the start. Don't underestimate the skills and work involved in making your product accessible. Wherever you are, the law probably requires that you meet WCAG AA conformance. Just check on that for your own peace of mind. And automated testing should be used only as an aid. It is never going to tell you whether you're accessible or not, but it is a very useful aid to have. And accessibility overlays won't make your site accessible. They just won't. Okay, so that's it.